Okay, well, welcome everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And my name is John R. I am an average alcoholic, among a bunch of other things. I am also the co-founder of Freethinkers Living Sober group, an AA group that is secular. Our group started in 2014 with one meeting face-to-face and 13 members, and then it grew to 4 meetings. And our population in Cottonwood is only 10,000, so that should tell you something. We now have 4 meetings a week, all on Zoom since March, and 70 regular members. Half of our regular members are from the Verde Valley, but almost all the others are either from the United States or a few of them are international. We're really happy you joined us, and we hope that you find this useful information. This idea was born of um, watching a really interesting presentation that Dr. Berger gave at Founders Day. And so we're really honored and extremely grateful to have our panelists joining us today. All of them have long-term sobriety, or recovery, I should say, one kind or another, including Dr. Berger and Marya Hornbacher and Joe C. and me. And I want to tell you a little bit about our presenters. Um, Dr. Alan Berger is a popular public speaker and nationally recognized expert on the science of recovery. And uh, he's the author of 12 Stupid Things That Mess Up Recovery and 12 Smart Things to Do When the Booze and Drugs Are Gone, among other things. He spent the last several years writing and focusing and presenting seminars on the subject of emotional sobriety. We're thrilled to have him with us today, and we recommend his book, 12 Smart Things, as a follow-up for our meeting today. Marya Hornbacher is a New York Times best-selling author, journalist, poet, and teacher who's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Her books include Waiting, A Non-Believer's Higher Power, Wasted, A Memory of Anorexia and Bulimia, which has been published in 12 languages, and most recently, the recovery book Sane, Mental Illness, Addiction, and the 12 Steps. If you haven't read her work, we highly recommend it. Personally, Waiting is one of my favorite books all time. Joe C. may well be familiar to most of our attendees, since his beyond belief agnostic musings for our music for a 12-step life is very popular among the secular AA community. Aside from being an author and friend, he's also a dad, a songwriter, a radio host, a financial planner, and sober since 1976. We're also very honored to count him as a member of our home group Away from Home at Freethinkers Living Sober group. Um, the I gotta look where I am. I need some to do a little bit of housekeeping. First, I'd really like to thank our volunteers who are supporting this webinar in the background. John Sheldon is our stage manager. Kat Little Creek is our timekeeper and Q&A host. And Mark Schultz is our technical advisor should you have problems during the webinar. Thank you guys. We couldn't have done this without you. The webinar has a Q&A function, which allows you to ask questions. You can ask them anonymously or include your name. Now, there are a lot of attendees. Right now, we're at 241, but over 400 signed up. So we will try to get to the questions, but we won't be able to get to them all. So please feel free to upvote questions that people ask if it's a question that you have as well. If your question is for technical help, I'd ask that you put the word tech in front of the question so that Mark can take a look at it. If your question is for a specific panelist, you might use their name first and then ask the question. Please remember, even though most of the attendees may be in recovery and in the same 12-step program you're in, that's not true of everyone here. So please remember the webinar is being recorded and will be available for distribution over the web in audio format. Check our website at freethinkerslivingsober.org for updates. But keep anonymity in mind when asking or responding to questions or answers. We do have a feedback page, and we really want your feedback, your ideas and contributions. We'll also try and address the unanswered questions there. Our regular website is just freethinkerslivingsober.org, but we have a special website just for emotional sobriety, and we'll post these URLs in the chat periodically. As people come and go, they won't see the previous chats. There's no charge for this webinar, but we do have a contributions page if you'd like to help us with the expenses for this or any future endeavors. Please select webinar from the drop-down list at the PayPal thing, so that this is the agenda. And the agenda is to have each of us present a little bit for about 15 minutes. And the webinar on emotional sobriety should last about 3 hours with a break between part 1 and part 2. And then in part 2, Dr. Berger will lead part 2 with all of the panelists. Without any further ado, I am honored and happy to introduce one of my favorite authors, Marya Hornbacher. Marya, it's all yours.
This is, I feel like such an inept human at these computery things. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm excited to be here myself. I hate going first on these things, so y'all can just, put me next or last next time. I'm just going to talk a little bit about something that's on my mind a lot lately. As it says in the agenda, I'm talking a little bit about the cycle of craving, crisis, and crash. I'm actually not going to talk much about the cycle itself, but really about how that becomes a pattern, at least in my life. And I see it in perhaps some other people's lives as well. So I hope this is useful. I look forward to questions, and I'm going to hit it. Emotional sobriety is in part about growing up. It's in part about detachment. It's about letting go of the things to which I cling. And I do know myself to be capable of clinging to just about anything. But above all, for me, it's about insight. It's a matter of developing the skill of seeing and seeing clearly, not so that I can judge and label aspects of experience good or bad, but so I can accurately evaluate what is going on around and within me and make skillful decisions about how to act henceforth. The determining factor for me in whether I'm able to see things clearly and therefore in whether I deal with situations skillfully is my own frame of mind. And for me, emotional sobriety hinges upon an ongoing effort to maintain as balanced or as neutral a frame of mind as I can. That is, for starters, virtually impossible for a human being. By definition, I am subjective, a single consciousness, sharply limited by the parameters not only of what I perceive, but also of what I wish to perceive. In other words, my mind, all minds, tilt ever toward its own convenience, preference, bias, and ultimately its own ease. When reality does not conform to those things, my mind starts to revolt. It begins to correct, to reshape, to revise what it perceives to suit itself. Thus, one of my tasks as a human being seeking balance, accuracy, and emotional skill is to work directly against the habits of my own humanness. In some ways, I have to work against my own humanness if I wish to become more humane. Here's a phrase I like. It is what it is. I can't tell you when that phrase came into pretty much ubiquitous usage. It's an interesting intersection between the superficiality of pop culture parlance, humanist ethics, and the maddening wisdom of simple truth. It's a phrase I use a lot, both aloud and in conversation with myself. It keeps me mindful of a central fact of existence that I am still terribly prone to forget, which is that I am not running this particular show. Reality, what is in the cosmic sense, does not answer to me or to my whims, nor will it, nor should that at this point come as a surprise. The world in which I live, the people with whom I connect or don't connect, the lives that intersect with my own are not under my purview, nor is their behavior something I can control. They are what they are. It is what it is. The extent of my serenity, my stability, and above all, my peace of mind is directly proportionate to my awareness of reality and my ability to accept and to deal with it as such. Those are words we hear a lot: awareness, willingness, acceptance. They're also conditions. They're states of mind, emotional places in which I can situate myself and from which I can proceed. I say I can because sometimes I don't. When I do, I find myself better able to navigate reality as it is. When I don't, I find myself quickly and often quite seriously lost in the weeds. The weeds, those patches of our interior landscape that are clogged with rot and murk and stagnant water and slick patches and sinkholes and general stink, are a little different for each of us, I guess, though I'd venture that the emotional swamps into which we wander, whether through laziness, willfulness, or nothing more complex than a lack of compass or map, are not as terminally unique and intriguing as we might like to think they are. Lately, I find that the world itself seems particularly rife with opportunities for me to go tromping off the path my better self would choose. At every turn, it seems I'm faced with the option to indulge my taste for anger and self-righteousness and judgment and critique and blame. If I turn in another direction, I find equally rich opportunities to wade into the fray of hopelessness, helplessness, solipsism, self-hatred, drama, and despair. Around the corner, I find a chorus of support for my own materialism, acquisitiveness, superficiality, vanity, and greed. A bit down the way, I come across a virtually limitless source of justifications for all the self-justification I could ever need. Hang on. I see notes in the side that I am hidden. Is that accurate? Anyone?
No,
Anyone?
we can see you.
Looks good from here.
Okay, all right, continuing, thank you. Just so you know, some people I think can't. I don't care if you can see me as long as you can hear me. In fact, if you can't hear me, it's not that big a deal either. As with everything that is interesting, the process of seeking out and deepening emotional sobriety involves grappling with this kind of paradox. There's another paradox I like. In order to become less selfish, I really do need to understand myself. That, for me, requires a practice of identifying the patterns. Patterns I've learned, patterns I've developed, patterns of behavior and thought that recur in my life across eras and decades, across states and countries, across friendships and relationships, workplaces and places of spiritual practice, across substances and compulsions galore. Until and unless I recognize the patterns in my life, patterns that are not imposed by destiny or stumbled upon by random chance, but that I myself seem to construct and reconstruct regardless of external circumstance, I won't be able to see that I am responsible for their existence, nor will I understand at any deep level that I and only I have the power to put them to rest. The pattern most familiar to me, one I cannot say I like, but also cannot fairly say I don't, given the frequency with which it has cropped up in my life, albeit wearing any number of different hats, is the pattern of crisis. The word crisis, of course, describes a single event. One says, I'm in crisis, I'm having a crisis, there is a crisis, this is a crisis. But actually the idea of crisis as singular, as isolated, belies a misunderstanding of science. Specifically, the idea that crisis is sudden denies the fundamental cosmic law of cause and effect. Crisis is never without cause. It is never sudden or random. It is always the culmination of previous events, actions, and reactions. Crisis is always an effect. Once set in motion, of course, crisis can become self-perpetuating. Crisis gives rise to crisis, gives rise to crisis, and then there you are in the pattern of crisis, looking back across your 30 or 40 or 70 or 85 years of life that you've spent setting fires and then putting them out. Anton Chekhov, the playwright and short story writer, is said to have said, any idiot can handle a crisis. And indeed, most of us probably grew up with or in enough chaos to come by our familiarity and skill with crisis management, honestly enough. The challenge in emotional sobriety is to learn other skills, and the reward of deepening emotional sobriety over time is in becoming adept at other, quieter, and ultimately more lasting things. The cycle of crisis, at least in my life, goes more or less like this. That's a great question. I just got a question. Define humanness. I can't. If someone else can, I would love to know what that means. Whoever asked that, I love it. Thank you. Humanness. The things that are endemic to us, perhaps, as we are all human beings. Certainly not universal. Anyway, the challenge in emotional sobriety is to learn other skills and more lasting things that are, we come by in sobriety, blah, blah. The cycle of crisis goes more or less like this. We come from the lives from which we come. They are messy and often full of crisis. We may develop a certain pride, perhaps earned but not productive, in how much we've lived through, how bravely we've fought, and how hard won our survival really is, and it is. But once we've moved out of that stage of our lives, where do we go? What is our purpose? What makes us feel useful, skillful, fulfilled? What feeds our sense that we are needed and wanted and loved? What earns us our place and our share of air in this world? How do we stave off the boredom of regular life when crisis has shaped our understanding of what it means to feel alive? Discomfort often sets in. There's an itch, an emptiness, a restlessness, an ache, some kind of internal pressure that builds in us and wants to break open. It keeps us up nights, dipping our toes in the shallows of water we often know runs deeper than we can see. We turn and reach for it, whatever it is. If not the bottle or the drug or behavior we've sworn off, then maybe some safer substitute. The lover with whom we do nothing but fight. The family drama that's not ours to fix. The friend who's incessantly a mess. The shopping, the food, the porn, the rabbit hole websites, something as simple and harmless as work. Hours and days and weeks and months later, we look up and wonder where the time went. There's maybe a pang of guilt or a fear that's uncomfortable. So we dive back in. Whatever the specifics of this pattern are for each of us, the cycle is the same. We seek comfort and solace and maybe escape. We find it for a time. But the addictive process, which we all know well enough, never ends there. That desire for comfort becomes craving. The craving gives way to seeking. The seeking gives rise to a chase and the thrill of the chase. When we catch what we think it is we're after, we cling to it, we depend upon it, we become dependent upon it, and at that same instant, we realize that even the thing itself is not enough. Craving sets in again. We push it and push it and push it until we're back at crisis once again. The pattern of crisis isn't the only pattern to which I'm prone. There are plenty of others, but it is the one that is most all-consuming and the most distracting. It functions to take me out of my own life, out of this world, out of reality as it is. Emotional sobriety for me requires attention to that reality and acceptance of it. It also allows me to find in that reality beauty and peace and transformation and joy. I'll hand it off to our next friend. Thanks.
Thank you, Marya. So, as I said, my name is John R. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I have been doing this for a number of years. My sobriety date is back in 1981. I'd like to tell you a little bit of my story as it relates to spiritual bypassing, which is my topic. But first, I want to say from the outset that I don't mean to imply that the paths I took were responsible for the way I took them, or that those spiritual processes are inherently paths that lead to spiritual bypassing. In addition, this is just a thumbnail sketch that covers a small bit of a journey I took for many years, and that journey continues today. So I remember as a kid wandering around by myself in the fields of Thousand Oaks, California, and enjoying being alone, being in nature and the quiet of the walks. And of course, Thousand Oaks in the 50s was very different than it is now. You could wander around for hours without being disturbed by traffic or houses or people. My earliest memories were of feeling that I wasn't really part of any of the groups of kids I knew, or of the adults in my life, or even of my own family. I was the fifth of six children and much younger than my older siblings. From my earliest moments, I always felt there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't enough, that I didn't measure up or belong, or, um, you know, I only felt okay when I was alone, really. Even when I was sick as a kid, my MO was to be by myself. I still am pretty much that way. My dad had been a pretty well-known news broadcaster with CBS, and my mother had an office supply bookstore after my dad bought the local paper to change his careers. So I had very little interaction with them from a pretty early age. My older siblings were all pretty busy being teenagers to bother with me. And like probably everybody, I learned most of my really great life techniques Some people call them character defects, others defense mechanisms. But I learned them in my formative years. I learned that to be heard or seen, I needed to get very angry or use my intelligence and language to win the day. And I was also a victim of sexual, emotional, mental, and physical abuse. So I can trace a lot of my underlying conflicts and patterns of perception, as well as my reactions to life and living, back to both a lack of attachment to a caregiver and also to the trauma of abuse in my earliest years. The pain that underlay these experiences was a significant factor in my learning to use spiritual methods to avoid that pain, the pain that kept bubbling up beneath the surface of my consciousness. Of course, I wasn't aware of that for many years. My family wasn't particularly religious. I remember seeking out various churches to find an answer to life's meaning and how to escape the disconnectedness. I felt that to overcome the problem, I needed to overcome the problem of me, of being me. So that by the time I was about 11, I started acting on stage in a community theater. And not coincidentally, that's when I started drinking. Acting brought me a lot of relief. Um, you know, Actually, what I know now is that acting may have saved my life for a time. What I really wanted was to just disappear. I wanted to get rid of the me that wasn't enough and was such a mistake. And in acting, I found emptying out myself and inhabiting a character gave me a lot of relief, both emotionally and mentally. I mean, it was okay to express pain and emotion as a character, but after the play was over, I needed to book out the back door of the theater. So by the time I went to college, I had found psychedelics in addition to alcohol and other drugs. Psychedelics, yay! What a great way to escape into the void and disappear from being me. Except I kept coming back to everyday earth time. So I sought out methods to stay there. I did Raja Yoga, meditation, etc., etc., etc. And my second year of college, I was approached by a group of radical, fanatical Jesus freaks who said, drop out, follow Jesus. They lived communally all over the world and seemed to have a real connection emotionally and mentally with each other. And that was real attractive. So I dropped out of college, and for about 8 or 9 years, I became a evangelical fundamentalist disciple of Jesus. I thought that the ministry would save me from the self that was, according to their theology and my inner narrative, intrinsically sinful and worthless. I memorized verses from the Bible, I preached the word, led different communes in the United States. Through it all, I never quite felt real or authentic or anything else sufficiently to overcome my sinful nature. Now, part of the problem I've learned was that I was trying to die to self and leave the past behind. The problem was that I never actually dealt with the past to leave it behind. So instead, I became more and more dependent on booze to get me by, which took me out of that ministry, and my subsequent abuse got worse and worse after that. I had a wife and 4 children by then, and life became impossible for her too. I abandoned the family to continue my downward spiral into my hoped for oblivion and death. But by 1981, faced with the fact that I wasn't going to get to die, I made the rash decision to go to a 12-step meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and check out their theology. Fortunately, they didn't really have much, and I managed to get sober for the first time in many, many years. But even when I got to the program and stayed sober and worked the steps, there was still that sense that the idea was to rise above and climb the mountains of spirituality. Barely beneath the surface of my consciousness, there was this sense that if I did it all correctly, including all the spiritual processes I tried, Then I would become a truly spiritual man and rise above all conflict and walk placidly amid the noise and haste with long flowing robes and be one with the spiritual being I thought I was supposed to be and be untouched by anything like a real human emotion. Then I would be loved and lovable. Well, I spent several years in more than one 12-step program, CODA, Al-Anon, SLAA, ACOA, among them. And I really did my best to work the program in each of them. All of them helped a lot in terms of my behavior and my ability to cope with life, my inner work, but I couldn't shake that sense that there was just something deeply wrong with me. It was my ego or my soul. Or here's some of the spiritual things I tried during my years in the program. I came in a Christian, but had trouble with some of the beliefs in the rooms that didn't agree with my theology. Things like the 24-hour-a-day book, which used to really tick me off. My sponsor said, stop reading it. I tried a very painful brand of sexuality, which is beyond the scope of this talk, in an effort to go beyond myself. I got into various types of meditation, like Shakti Gawain's creative visualization in the 80s, New Age things like the I Ching, the Book of Runes, etc. I began seriously studying Buddhism around my 7th year of sobriety in an effort to overcome the self, to enter into the stream of enlightenment and fix myself or non-self, as the case may be. Essentially, I was using the same approach to Buddhism and meditative techniques as I had with Christianity and with the other 12-step programs. And I was also adopted later on into a Lakota family by a very famous medicine man and began learning ceremonial ways of the Red Road. But in each case, the underlying axiom was the same delusion I hadn't yet uncovered. I'm not enough. I'm a defective character. I have to find a way to eradicate that self and become okay. If I only worked hard enough, prayed long enough, did the right ceremonies the right way, I would become what I was not, whole and complete and free of pain. Here are some of the key phrases and ideas that reinforce the delusion I needed to annihilate myself to become okay. My inner understanding and approach as a Christian had emphasized this tendency toward annihilation of self with things like, but we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. And that's from Isaiah. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells, from Romans. In 12-step programs, phrases like the ego must be smashed, which isn't in the big book, by the way, and my best thinking got me here were very attractive to my desire to disappear. These attacks on the self aren't part of my inner dialogue anymore since I consider them self-abuse, but I still hear people using them all the time. And in Buddhism, I thought emptiness and no self equated to the same disappearing act that would save me from the pain. If desires cause suffering, then detaching and not feeling or having desires should make me safe, right? I have since learned better about Buddhist precepts, but it was a painful road to let go of the underlying delusions. By the time I was 11 years into my sobriety, all of those efforts to rise above my own humanness and gain freedom from myself landed me in the desert outside of Tucson, Arizona, in a treatment center with a dozen or so other double-digit sober people. They did a whole battery of tests, and the psychiatrist asked me afterwards, how long have you been depressed? I said, is that what this is? I didn't know I was depressed. Well, partially it was that. You know how people always say, stop and smell the roses? Well, I couldn't smell them. But actually, the treatment I received there was a first step in my journey out of that delusion of self-annihilation. And one of the first fruits was being able to smell the flowers at the treatment center. In other words, all my efforts to rise above my own humanness, to disappear and gain freedom from myself, were really an effort to avoid the pain of uncovering trauma in my history. This, despite working all the steps on it as much as I could, The fact is, this psychological suicide delusion was ultimately placing a great dependence on the various paths like God, meditation, the 12 steps, myself, spirituality, to solve a problem that wasn't even the problem. It wasn't the real problem. As one of my early sponsors said to my suicidal thoughts, you'd be killing the wrong person. So what is spiritual bypassing, and why couldn't I see it after all the step work and the therapy and all of that stuff, you know? Well, um, I hope I'll be able to share a little bit on that with you. Um, I've just about run out of time, so I don't know how much I'm going to get to share, but I will try to do some of it. Spiritual bypassing, in my case, was a deeply held defense mechanism and an avoidance technique. In John Wellwood said, spiritual ideas and practices are there to sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business, to shore up a shaky sense of self, belittle basic needs. I really did a lot of belittling of my basic needs, feelings, and development. Here's some of the signs of spiritual bypassing. Some of them I did experience, some of them I didn't. Um, Things like being self-righteous about enlightenment, salvation, or sobriety, um, dependence on spiritual ideas and beliefs to avoid unwanted emotions, pretending everything is okay, presenting a false self, presenting oneself as either having all the answers or none of the answers. There are two sides of the same coin. So I can see that I'm not going to be able to give you the whole presentation about this, but I will post it on the website when I get a chance. And the one thing I do want to mention is that phrase, ultimately happiness comes down to choosing between the discomfort of becoming aware of your mental afflictions and the discomfort of being ruled by them. It's really difficult to go through some of this stuff. And I know that uh, a lot of times people think that if they're feeling bad, they're doing something wrong. But one of the things one of my sponsors said to me is, you might be doing something right. And sometimes that discomfort is an important part of doing it, of going through the process. So it may be important to recognize that sometimes the pain doesn't just magically go away. Sometimes, like with deep meditation practice, the pain seems to intensify. So fact is, in my case, going through pain didn't necessarily mean I was doing something wrong. I would really like to take this opportunity now and honor to introduce my friend and partner in creating this webinar, Joe C.
Hi, everybody. I would do this again next week with 4 different people up here. We've got a fairly sophisticated audience. A lot of people here we could switch places and do this all the time, but working with everybody here has been a total thrill, and it's something I've looked forward to. Emotion. One of the things touched on already is crisis is part of life, and feeling bad isn't a problem with emotional stability because it just comes with the territory. I've had I've had loss this year from our history community. Glenn Chestnut passed away. His Zoom memorial is on September 12th. You might not know his name, but a lot of what we all know about addiction and recovery and the history of especially peer-to-peer groups, we learned through his diligence and hard work, and those are big shoes to fill. And I'd rather be doing a history seminar on underrepresented populations in 12-step communities or whatever, because emotions, I cry less when I talk about AA history. And I don't know what we have in store today. And and the loss of Glenn just sort of touched some other losses. 2015, Ernie Kurtz had just become a great mentor to me, and we lost him, and that was sort of hard. I'm going to sort of channel Ernie Kurtz a little bit here, and none of these slides are really necessary for the presentation. They are just my way of dealing with my ADHD, but from a great book by Ernie Kurtz and Catherine Ketchum, Experiencing Spirituality. If you don't know it, it was the 20-year follow-up to the spirituality of imperfection. And I don't know if you can see this well. Let me just here. But yeah, this definition hits me in the heart. Confusion. Something within us occasionally suggests that we are made for other than we now are. We somehow fail to grasp the present. Some see this as unease, a kind of deviation, a sign of maladjustment or illness. Others locate it in the essence of our humanity, which many seek to express in art. There seems to be some kind of confusion buried at the very core of being. It seems impossible for many of us to simply be, simply to experience, simply to anything. And yeah, I spent a lot of my life in and out of sobriety feeling like everyone else looked like they felt like they belonged and I felt like I didn't. But the thing with confusion, as Ernie and Catherine point out, is in a healthier sense, it's mystery. There's going to be mystery in life. And I try to stamp out mystery with evidence and facts and all of that sort of thing because I'm more comfortable with that. But, you know, still a lot of my life is full of mystery. So when it comes to sort of spiritual health, or I hardly ever use that word, or emotional sobriety, which I prefer a lot better, there's three things I'm going to sort of touch on. I think emotions have to be regulated, not amputated. The idea that I have these defective parts of me that I've got to remove to be good enough or whatever has just been, while effective for many, I'm sure, sort of self-destructive for me. So I don't want to amputate, I want to regulate my emotions. And then feelings, I can't reason my way out of. Emotional issues, I would rather use my brain to solve. And I don't know about you, but in my case, I'm way more comfortable from the neck up than from the neck down. When I get into how I feel in my gut and how I feel in my heart, I'm not so articulate. And the other one is I've really found in latter sobriety to aim for sober enough. To have healthy blood pressure isn't a perfect blood pressure. There's too high and there's too low, and there's a range. And so I try to live within a range. Back in sort of big book days, they talked about clearing out the wreckage of the past as only having three feelings: anger, lust, and fear, or resentment, fear, and our sex conduct, as it was put. It said in there something about some of us once had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem or any other. When it made us cocky, it was worse. And then they have this solution. Let me just, we should have mood music. Okay, so I'm gonna just, I can't get out of that, so I'm gonna just skip that. But in one of my last blogs, there's two mathematicians looking at an equation, and there's all of this sophisticated math over here and the answer over here. So let's call A the chaos of addiction, and over here is the beauty and peace of recovery. And then for B in the middle, the mathematician has, then a miracle happens. And the other mathematician is saying, I think you need to maybe work on part 2 a little bit here. And there's a lot of that in AA, of course, and all of us have a B. It's because of the meetings, it's because of the therapy, it's because of the whatever, you know. So there's more than one answer for that. Because I find that this idea of sort of self-cannibalizing, trying to eliminate all of my hostility, eliminating my anger, eliminating my lust, my desires, is just, it doesn't work out in real life, because I see in people, like we know now, we didn't know in 1939, and I wouldn't have written any better a book back then than the rest of them did, but you know, there's something called reactance, where people can take that anger and turn it into purpose. I've seen people come into secular AA and they are just angry at the way people roll their eyeballs and say, keep coming back, or I'll pray for you, or, you know, just that's, keep an open mind, all that sort of stuff. And they channel that anger into I'll show them. And I don't know if I'll show them is the best reason for any of us to stay sober, but show me a bad reason to stay sober. You know, like it gets people through. And I'm sure, you know, thumpers sort of channel that sort of watered down AA fear, or all that treatment talk, and, you know, so on and so forth into, you know, just sort of, they channel that sort of fear or anger about AA changing or becoming watered down, and they turn it into something positive. So it's about regulating. It's not about eliminating. Like I want to be spontaneous. The problem was when I drank, it was total chaos, sometimes nihilism. So the answer isn't to eliminate all of my spontaneity and replace it with structure, because then I just got structure sort of growing into rigidity, and then eventually tyranny. And that doesn't work. I need structure and I need spontaneity. I need to be empathetic, but I don't want to be codependent, and I don't want to be malevolent. You know, I want to be emotional. I don't want to be indifferent. I don't want to be melodramatic. It's not a matter of sort of homeostasis, that perfect balance, because different circumstances call for different needs. And this is something that I wish I knew in my first 20 years of sobriety, because I still tried to keep getting it right. And then there was the reasoning thing. Many of you know the story about Intergroup in Toronto, where we got delisted by the Intergroup floor, our 2 agnostic meetings in Toronto. And I was there, and I went there prepared, and I knew there was going to be a debate, and I knew, like I've seen this, I'd been to sort of central office meetings for 34 years, and I know every issue that comes up, people line up pretty quickly on one side or the other of an issue. And, you know, they feel very strongly about it. And everyone says their piece, everyone feels heard. And then AA does the AA thing of love and tolerance and kumbaya, and everybody's happy. And so I expected that to be the case. And I was ready. I knew my traditions. I knew my concepts. I had all my Bill W. quotes ready for any rebuttal. And you know, we said our thing and we got voted out. And that was that. I went home, I was broken. I grew up in AA. I mean, I was raised by AA wolves. I mean, I 14 at my first meeting, 16 by the time I was sober, and now I'm being told your kind aren't welcome here. Hit the road, Jack. And I was beside myself, and I was in shock. I was traumatized. And in time, I came to understand that, it's really, it wasn't believers against non-believers. It was just sort of a hatchet job that was done. And I also came to understand that I was trying to reason people out of a position they came to emotionally. And how can that work? Proving someone is wrong doesn't warm them up to your way of thinking. And I don't know why I even try that with myself. Why do I think I can reason myself out of my emotional problems? It's like reading about swimming. I got to get wet if I'm going to learn how to swim. And then the other thing is trying to be sober enough. I remember there was supposed to be a big event in 1996, and that was going to be my 20-year medallion. I'd been planning that from my first year cake, thinking, wow, I'll be 36, 20 years sober. Wow, I'm all that in a bag of chips. I will, be upwardly mobile. It'll be great. And at 20 years sober, I was in 2 custody battles with 2 boy meets girl on AA campuses where we had children. I had a son and a daughter, and I was in conflict with their mothers. I just found out I was HIV positive. By then, like John, I was a member of lots of 12-step fellowships and had problems other than alcoholism. And I did not want to be paraded up in front of anybody as an example. The reality was a lot of what was going on was age appropriate, but I just felt like I'm supposed to be some sort of example of the promises of AA, and I definitely wasn't. And the other thing about being sober enough is I need to practice my emoting. And I'm great with cerebral learning, but I need to go to art. I need to play. To get emotional, I need to cry at the opera. I need to listen to people's stories. And we started out with Ernie, and I'm going to read something for you that was read at his funeral by his sister. And this is, if you really find the 1939 Big Book too old, this is the 1922 The Velveteen Rabbit, How Toys Become Real by Marjorie Williams, and I'll end with this. Between them, all the poor little rabbit was made to feel himself very insignificant and commonplace. And the only person who was kind to him was the skin horse. The skin horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was old, his brown coat had worn off underneath, and most of the hair on his tail had been pulled out to string beard necklaces. He was wise, for he had seen long successions of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away. And he knew that they were only toys and would never turn into anything else. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced, like the skin horse, understand all about it. What is real? Asked the rabbit one day when they were lying side by side near the nursery fender. Does it mean having things that buzz inside you or a stick-out handle? Real isn't how you're made, said the skin horse. It's the things that happen to you when a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you. You become real. Does it hurt? Asked the rabbit. Sometimes, said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. When you are real, you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once or bit by bit? It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, have sharp edges, or who are carefully kept. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair is loved off, your eyes droop out, your joints are broken, you're very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly except to people who don't understand. I suppose you're real, said the rabbit. And then he wished he hadn't said it, for he thought the skin horse might be sensitive. But the skin horse only smiled. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joe. Wonderful. Appreciate it. And now I'd like to introduce my friend and uh, the originator of this idea, really, Dr. Alan Berger. Alan?
Well, thank you. Can you see there we go. Well, wow. I'm sure that those of you that are out there and part of our experience today are quite touched and moved as I am here. I just want to recognize all of the panelists and how incredibly vulnerable and articulate and evolved you guys are, so I'm really, really very pleased to be a part of this group and honored. I want to talk to you about this whole concept and try to define it really quickly. So let me just pull up a slide. This whole concept of emotional sobriety, because I think it's really becoming, I think, Bill's hope that this would be the next development in AA is starting to be fulfilled. And I'm glad to be a part of that. So here's the problem in a nutshell. Life happens to us, and you've heard that. I mean, every one of the panelists have described different experiences they've had. Now, the real challenge that we all have is how to deal with what goes on in life, right? In the rooms, we hear that the program is about dealing with life on life's terms. Well, I never knew how to do that. That wasn't a part of my experience growing up at all. I was very, very lost in a bunch of supposed to's. Life is supposed to be this way. It shouldn't happen like this. You should be this way. You should be that way. And I thought, John, you talked very, very well about that and the experiences you have. So we object, right? We object. We say it's not supposed to be this way. And what I know is that where we focus is where our energy goes. So if I'm all focused on what's wrong with this and not liking it, I'm not going to be able to cope with it. That's the bottom line. And so my energy, the energy that would be available, is no longer available to cope. And that creates this thing that we all experience from time to time. I think, Joe, you said it very well. There's a whole range to our experience in recovery. Sober suffering is the term Fred Holmquist used. And I love that term. But this is Ernie Larson, and he's just a very, very insightful person. Ernie passed away a number of years ago, but he's left us a lot of great writings. But he said, the fact is that many people reach a dead end or plateau in their personal recovery. And if they do not understand what is occurring, they frequently feel that they are losing their recovery. What I like to say is trouble in recovery does not mean something's wrong. It really means something's right, because if you're living in your recovery and you're living consciously, you're going to hit the outer bounds of your development. And so what I say is, when trouble happens, it's an opportunity for us to take that next step in our development, to grow ourselves up. This is how Ernie describes stage 2 recovery. And I think in a lot of ways, we can think of stage 2 recovery as synonymous with emotional sobriety. He goes, dealing with the mountain of living is what stage 2 recovery is all about. Is about getting on with life by facing those patterns, habits, and attitudes that control your life, and which, for perhaps the first time, you're clear-headed, sober, or emotionally sound enough to begin to face. I say all the time that only the best in us can see the worst in us. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. As we hear in the program all the time, more will be revealed. And what happens is the healthier you become, the more messed up you can see yourself as being. And that's good news, not bad. So very few people realize that Bill, when he was writing the 12 ins 12, finally defined the goal of working the steps. And in his discussion, in fact, it's at the end of the first paragraph when he's starting to discuss the 12th step, he goes, here we begin to practice all of the 12 steps of the program in our daily lives so that we and those about us can find emotional sobriety. Well, of course, the first step in that stage 1 recovery is physical sobriety. But the second step of that is this emotional sobriety. So let's define that to try to get some ideas. So my definition changes all the time. If we do this a few months from now, which we've been talking about, following this up with a few more programs, and I think, you know, based on what everybody's sharing, there's a lot of room for us to talk about them more, but here's the definition I'm currently using. So emotional sobriety is a mental state in which we do not react to our changing emotions as though they were governing facts of our lives. Just as alcohol or drug sobriety emerges as we gain independence from our addictive urges, emotional sobriety emerges as we gain freedom from our emotional storms. We recognize that our emotions are reactions to people and conditions around us, and we give them simply the amount of attention that is reasonable or fitting for the specific situation. Emotional sobriety develops when we accept life on its terms rather than demanding that life, which includes people and situations, conform to our expectations. When we do this, we gain emotional freedom, a true independence of spirit in which our innermost or truest self is a determining force in our lives. Emotional sobriety is an appropriate balance and coordination of all that we are. We'll talk about a lot of these things later, because in part 2 of our webinar today, we are actually going to unpack Bill's letter where he defines and really discusses in depth emotional sobriety. So a lot of these things will be developed and articulated later on. So emotional sobriety is when we bring into harmony the disharmonious aspects of ourselves so they can be joint contributors to our wholeness. And when we balance our need for togetherness with our desire to hold on to our separateness. It is when the best in us does the thinking and talking for all of us. Sometimes I add, it's when the best of us talks to the best in you. So this is an important concept. So I want to just elaborate on a few things. And like I said, when we get into part 2 today, we'll talk more about this. So I really believe that it's a lack of faith in ourselves to cope with life on life terms that leads to this emotional dependency. So what do I mean by that? Well, you see, if I had full confidence and faith in myself, then I wouldn't need things to be a certain way for me to be okay. You know, I would at that point just see myself as needing to respond to whatever is happening in my life. I'm a Gestalt therapist, and Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, says, you know, a healthy person is a person who totally lets the situation they're in control them. And when I first read that, I go, my God, you know, being a control freak in my life, I didn't understand that. I thought a healthy person would be somebody that can control what's going on. But it's not true. You see, what I need to do is to learn to deal with whatever tasks that life is setting before me, instead of demanding that things be the way I think they should. So what I believe that in any moment in our recovery, we can begin the process to break out of our emotional dependency and start to find emotional sobriety. And I love Virginia Satir. I mean, talk about a masterful, masterful therapist. She goes, life, it's not what it's supposed to be. It is what it is. It's the way we cope with it that makes the difference. And that's what this is all about, is figuring out how to cope with these things. But I'll tell you, what I did instead of coping with life is to try to manipulate everything so it would be my way, because I didn't have that faith in myself, and I didn't have the capacity at that point. I hadn't developed the capacity to better cope. So manipulation is the most dangerous threat to our emotional sobriety and our emotional nourishment, because it continues to reinforce the big lie that I need things to be a certain way to be okay, instead of being grounded in the idea that I need to be a certain way to be okay. So emotional dependency and the demands generated by our unhealthy dependency creates a blaming mentality, which hinders our ability to learn. You know, if I'm looking at who's at fault for this situation, I'm not paying attention to what I need to learn. Dr. Kempler, one of my mentors, used to say, you know, Alan, you know, when you see people, think about what kind of mother they have. Did they have a mother that when the milk was spilled in the kitchen, she ran in and said, "Who spilled that milk? Who did that?" Like the most terrible thing just happened. Or did you have a mother that came in the kitchen and says, "Oh, the milk got spilled. Let's get it cleaned up"? There's a big difference. My whole life was spent, at least the first half of my life was spent on whose fault is this? And of course, you know, most of the time I'd rather blame you than me, but I blame myself as much secretly, as John was talking about. So the quest for greater awareness of ourselves and our world is a healthy approach to living, and allows us to achieve emotional sobriety, because that's what you can hear in each of the panelists that talked about. You know, they had such a full awareness of their life and what was going on. And that's what we need to cultivate in terms of emotional sobriety. So the lack of inner intimacy, right? The relationship I have with myself, and the lack of self-support is the source of our emotional dependency. As we make progress towards emotional sobriety and more nourishing attitudes towards ourselves, towards life, we surrender our expectations that anyone or anything should be different from who they are or what it is at that particular moment in time. When we are dissatisfied or unhappy in our relationship, we need to take a hard look at what we expect from it and our way of being in it and giving to it. We need to become aware of our habitual ways of thinking and feelings, which give rise to our behavioral patterns. So that's a bit of an introduction. I did want to try to tackle that one great question that someone had a minute ago before we open this up to the panelists, because this will be part 2. But that question about, well, what is our humanness? Oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Okay, let me stop sharing this screen. What is humanness? Well, it's very interesting. There's a very simple way to think about it. And Abraham Maslow talked about this. He says, a rock does not want to be a tree. It's just a rock. A tree doesn't want to be a flower. A dog doesn't want to be a cat. But because of our cerebral cortex, which is our gift and our curse at the same time, we've got the ability to imagine things. And that's where things either become amazing because of the creativity that comes from that, or we can just terrorize ourselves with catastrophic, you know, projections into the future, into what's going to happen. So our humanness is an amazing thing. I mean, it really, really, you know, we're at the top of the food chain on this planet at this time. I don't know if that'll continue, but for now we are. And the reason is because of our ability to abstract and to have abstract thinking. And that's what that cerebral cortex does. So I think we were going to open this up for a while. John, is it what we do at this particular point in time? And
yeah, we were going to maybe have everybody, all the panelists come together, and if anybody has anything they want to add to your definition or to any of the comments that were made, I think that'd be great.
well, I saw one of the comments in the question and answer was, well, what about the kind of father you have? Because, you know, once again, moms get blamed all the time for this stuff, right? All that same thing. Father does that, it's going to have the same damage. Well, the problem is it's a bigger issue because it's a cultural issue. You know, we're always looking at who's to blame. And so it's not just a mom or a dad. I was just using that more symbolically. It's really just a whole orientation towards when there's a problem, we need to figure out whose fault it is instead of figuring out how best to deal with it.
That is really the problem in that the whole blame game. Now, it really helps us sort of understand what happened. But I mean, when we get to, my perpetrators were victims of other perpetrators who were victims of other perpetrators, how far back do you want to go to, blame somebody, right?
Kind of, to
Yeah.
me, kind of a regress of like when I get really wrapped up into whose fault is it that I'm like this, or why is this like it is, that isn't actually a productive thing for me to stay in for very long. A lot for me is like I identify, at least when I'm doing this in a way that's productive, I identify what I'm doing or what's going on. I look at some of the factorial things going on that are contributing to that. But at that point, I need to move on and be like, all right, this is where I am. This is where it's coming from. And now proceed. I mean, I can spend a long time in the whys and the wherefores, but if it doesn't actually change how I live, what's the purpose? Then it just becomes navel gazing. And I don't mean to say that those issues in my life aren't real or weren't problematic or weren't damaging or hurtful. It means that I always have the decision about how do I deal with that today, and how am I letting that influence me today. And that's, that goes to the question of, even when things weren't, for example, my fault, even if I'm looking at traumas or issues that have been not things I started or chose, that, we look at step 8 and the 12 and 12, and it says, there were things we did that allowed us, that we did things based on self that put us in a position later to be hurt. And also it asks us to look at what are the ways in which I've allowed these experiences to warp and shape my personality, and how am I acting those things out today? And so to me, it really does always become, perhaps it's simplistic, but it is functional. What am I doing about this now? It really does become a question I do need to ask myself daily.
The other thing that occurred to me when we were talking, or when you were talking about this, Alan, was I think one of the most difficult, and this came up in the question and answer thing. It was most difficult thing for me was to begin to have some compassion for myself and to give myself a little bit of a break. There's a whole lot of uh, talk about, well, it's all your ego and you shouldn't let your ego this and your ego that. And I'm not sure that that's even a useful word anymore. I don't know. For me, I really needed to learn how to let go of the self-bashing and um, there's a difference between looking at your patterns and your behavior and your thinking and attaching to it. And I did a lot of attaching to it, and a lot of my inner narrative was about me as the bad guy. So I think we're going to get into some of that in part 2, but to me that's probably, and the thing about just because you're in pain doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. One of the greatest gifts my sponsor gave to me was saying, you might be doing something right.
Well, you're right on, John. I mean, it's really the goal for me in recovery is to really become more alive, which is to be able to fully experience what's going on. And to do that, I had to let go of a lot of those ideas you were talking about, that you're supposed to be this way, or you should be like this. And I constructed a whole false self that I thought that if I could pull this off, if I could really engineer myself according to the blueprint of my false self, I would be loved, I'd be accepted, I would belong, the world would just work.
Yep.
Dr. Karen Horney, I love her. She called it the search for glory. If I could find that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or the Holy Grail, right? If I could just find the Holy Grail, that's going to be it, man. I've got it. It's going to all work now. Well, guess what? There's no pot of gold. There's no Holy Grail. Dr. Nathaniel Brennan says, no one is coming. No one is coming.
No Calvary.
No one's coming.
Yep.
No one's coming. You're going to have to find a way to show up and figure this thing out.
I heard somebody the other day talk about salvation. Forgive me, that's my background, but salvation as being coming home. And I really like that.
Yeah,
Took
me too.
me many years sober to be able to come home.
Yeah.
Someone asked a question about how do you know when you've processed trauma, and I'd really love to hear what everybody has about it. I would say that my relationship to it evolves. Like if I lose a leg, it's not going to grow back, and losses aren't going to come back. But my relationship to my trauma does evolve after time. And sometimes I cling on to it because it's my identity. I
Mhm.
remember I was in this, I was feeling really uncomfortable. Someone was talking about Buddhism, about bliss. And I thought, well, that's not a worthy goal, bliss. And I thought about why am I attached to my unhappiness? Why am I attached to my damage? Like it's my personality, right? Why couldn't I just let it go and be blissful? But anyway, I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say about that.
Well, let me share a little bit about our digestive system and how we digest food, right? Because it's really the prototype for mental health. So when you take a bite of an apple, and I think you're going to do that in a little bit here, Joe, right? You're going to have a little snack as we break. You know what you're going to do? First thing, you got to bite into it. You got to take responsibility that you want the nourishment, and so you reach out, you bring the apple to your mouth, you take a bite, and then you start to chew it up. You break it down because you have to start breaking down what you've just picked up to bring into your body for nourishment, for the body to digest it. And so you swallow it, it goes into your stomach, all these wonderful, amino acids and things start to get mixed with the food. And the stomach has some funny kind of muscles. It turns like this. So it actually starts to create like a mulch, right? That's going to get passed into your intestines. And as it starts to go through your intestines now, that's where the real digestion takes place, because your intestines are extracting from that apple what you need. And it's going to take fluid, and it's going to take other, vitamins and stuff like that. And at some point, the apple is no longer the apple. The apple becomes Joe.
Mm-hmm.
You're the apple, or the apple is you, right? It's that thing. You can't distinguish it. You could look into your body and say, we can't tell that there was an apple anymore. It's been integrated into Joe. What's not integrated is, what do we do with it?
Mm-hmm.
We get rid of it. We eliminate it, right? So it passes through our body. We urinate or we defecate, right? We get rid of those things that aren't going to nourish us. That's what has to happen with a trauma. We have to chew it up. We have to start to process it. We have to go into it. And we have to find the words that we wanted to say that we couldn't say at the time. We have to go through all of that, and maybe many, many times, to start taking from that what we need to grow ourselves. That's why people are talking about post-traumatic growth instead of talking about post-traumatic stress. We're saying that if you process these traumas in the right way, it will help you become what you can be.
And I think there's another thing that happened for me around, and I have no idea if I've processed all my trauma, but I'm
Right.
not even going to go there. But, but this may sound a little strange with my history of chronic depression and with the trauma. One of the things I had to learn was to open to it and to allow myself to be with it. I thought that if I ever let myself experience that, I'm a crier, what can I tell you? Experience that, I would never stop crying. I would be overwhelmed, and that's who I would be. And yet, just the opposite happened. Actually, now I cry at the drop of a hat. You give me the right commercial, and I'm liable to fall into tears. but but I love that because it opens the heart. But I had to open the heart. I had to first take the scab off the wound and allow myself to be with it. That was not an easy process. Has not been, still isn't. I don't want to make it sound like I'm done because I don't think I am. I'm still alive.
Well, because that integration comes at many different levels in terms of too, where your development is, John. That's been my experience. I mean, I lost my father in a very traumatic way when I was 11. And, for 7 years, 8 years, I wouldn't even touch those emotions. No, I couldn't. I just really think that I was protecting myself, right? I insulated myself from them. Now, before I would have pathologized myself for that. I was avoiding it. But what was it, avoiding it, or was it that I just didn't have the consciousness that could wrap itself around that loss? Right? And I love what you said. See, it's not what's wrong about us that gets us sick. It's what's right about us that we don't pay attention to. See, that's the big issue. And I thought what you shared was such a great illustration of that.
I want to respond to first of all, the idea of two questions here. Vicky is saying, you're done with a particular trauma when you're grateful that it happened. That's a degree of gratitude I don't always reach. I mean, there are things that happened to me, which are traumatic issues in my life and in the larger world that I'm never going to be super psyched about. And that actually leads me to a question brought up a little bit earlier about let's look at the world we're in. I'm never going to be excited that sexism and misogyny are rampant and extant, that homophobia and bigotry are rampant and extant. I'm never going to be excited about or even accepting particularly of racism in particular. And so those things, and I want to respond to somebody's question earlier about the fact that traumas that happen on the larger scale, in the global scale, in the larger world, aren't things that emotional sobriety to me does not mean, oh, I accept it and then I'm like, that's just how it is. And so that, to go back to that phrase, it is what it is, all that means for me is right now, it is what it is. That's where we are right now. And until I acknowledge this is where I am right now, whether that's I'm having trauma or I'm experiencing my own bullshit or I'm experiencing the bullshit of the world, I have to acknowledge that before I can get to a stage where I go, and now my next choice is, my next logical or the next right thing to go to the rooms, the words of the rooms. I can't make change. I can't resist situations that are extant in an effective and strategic way if I'm still caught in the emotional inebriety of my own pain. That doesn't mean the pain isn't real. It doesn't mean it's not valid.
That's
And it
right.
certainly does not mean I accept the pain that is caused grand scale out there in the world by larger issues that operate within us, within our bodies, on our bodies, in our lives. It doesn't mean that I accept and go, okay, that's how it is. It means I say, this is happening right now. I accept and face it. My next right thing is to take this action. And until I'm emotionally prepared to do that, I'm not productive. And so that's why I want to respond to the idea, this is not being a doormat. That's codependency, and we all know that way lies the liquor cabinet, at least for me. And so I don't lie down and go, this is what it is, and it's just how it is. That's helplessness. And to me, that's a hopelessness, that's a giving into situations that aren't actually acceptable long term. The accepting reality right now is a step on the way to making change on a larger scale.
What she said.
That's that was good.
John, Ellen needs to read the questions. There's several in there for him.
Alan, there are several questions in there for you. I'm wondering if this would be a good time for us to take a break and come back for part 2. Then we can review the questions and keep going. What do you
Thanks
think?
everyone for hanging in, by the way.
Okay, I think that sounds like that's an affirmative. So we'll have a 10-minute break and